Hello everyone, I'm Vista, and today I will be going over Indigenous land sovereignty and treaty for my PLC presentation. Land and community. How does Indigenous relationship with land rely on upholding a strong sense of community, and how has the Canadian government, alongside our overall highly Eurocentric society's tendency for interfering in Indigenous issues tied to cultural genocide, how have Indigenous peoples shown resistance against this issue? We already know the government inherently separates many Indigenous populations onto reserves, carrying on colonial ways into a form less physical, but more impactful in the sense of instigating mass cultural genocide, through knowing community is less likely to be upheld in this scenario. For example, it's harder to communicate with other groups, so they're less likely to be able to talk to one another. However, traditions such as powwows play a big role in resisting against the government, bringing various Indigenous communities together and solidifying that essential sense of community. This not only defines the importance of community in keeping Indigenous cultures alive and thriving, but also highlights its connection to the land through such traditions and cultural teachings, as powwows remind one of the land's importance to sustaining oneself, being grateful and mindful all the while. In Yinta, communal resistance is highlighted through Wet'suwet'en peoples' fight against industrial corporations destroying their land, through risking their safety with RCMP by taking over their construction sites and barricading entry roads as a protest. Throughout this, their community was brought together, so even though these protests failed against the government in the end, they became stronger in their cause, strengthening their connection to the land all the while. By now, we can see a repeated correlation between a strong sense of community to a strong connection to land, with a focus on how acts of resistance and carrying out cultural traditions serve as a big catalyst in this equation. This brings us to the conclusion of the interconnectedness of community to land. There is an evident contrast between the sense of identity of Indigenous people living in the city, more likely to have less of it, to those living amongst others sharing the same backgrounds, having more of it. This is a result of how our predominantly Eurocentric country creates isolation and a loss of sense of self and identity for everyone outside the white category, with how the system revolves around accommodating their ways and widely includes their people's population, making it hard for everyone else to uphold their sense of community while living in this country. The government knows this, which is why tragedies like the 60s scoop and residential schooling were unfortunately an excellent way to commit cultural genocide on Indigenous peoples, not only taking away their source of community, but also fully prohibiting cultural identity and expression and practices, where many teachings were lost, unable to be passed down to future generations, and making it near impossible for the survivors of these tragedies to ever truly reconnect or find their communities again. In conclusion, a better sense of self walks hand in hand with community, which is what allows one to develop a deeper relationship with land as a result. Ancestral and traditional knowledge. Bringing a focus to cultural teachings and traditions, how do they tie into being a main component of keeping Indigenous cultures alive and thriving, as well as upholding narrative sovereignty? How does this compare to Eurocentric ways and hypocrisy? We already know that balance plays a key role in many Indigenous cultures, being an integral part of what it takes to achieve higher spiritual maturity and in being better in tune with one's center, in order to strengthen connection to land. This balance is upheld through balancing our mother and father sides, where women are seen higher than men due to their gift of life. There is a big importance placed on women, with their gift being a source of strength. On the other hand, Eurocentric society has had a big gender bias in favor of men for centuries, having a deep-rooted sexism embedded into their system that places the gift of life as a weakness, even creating a stigma around girls' and women's menstrual cycles. Furthermore, Eurocentric colonies and countries have had a big part in colonizing other countries or at least meddling in their affairs, such as presidential elections, especially in the past century, to serve in their own self-interests, such as oils and natural resources, which often changes those entire countries' systems for the worst. An example is Iran in 1979, where the US sent people to instigate a coup against the current Shah, causing Khomeini to turn the country into a Nazi-esque dictator's utopia. The hypocrisy lies in the fact that these same Eurocentric countries that caused these issues in the first place now criticize and blame their victim countries for their systems today, even though they were the ones who caused such systems to occur in the first place. Moving on, let's dive into how Indigenous teachings affect culture and land. We already know that Indigenous cultures follow a more slow-paced lifestyle, which allows one to live in tune with nature's clock, further flourishing one's identity and spiritual connection to land. This is a stark contrast to the fast-paced lifestyle of Eurocentric society, which in turn causes one to be blinded to the little things that happen around us on the daily, putting greater distance between us and our relationship with land, which is why we're so relentless and so quick in polluting Mother Earth for maximum profits. Taking a look at Indigenous teachings being passed down, this is an essential aspect that keeps cultures alive through storytelling. This ties back to the idea of narrative sovereignty, where outsiders telling these stories would take away authentic Indigenous voices, creating false stereotypes and narratives, as well as an overall bad representation of Indigenous peoples, especially in the media. Aboriginal and treaty rights. Let's take a deeper look at the government's role in Indigenous land treaties and their true motives behind creating legal loopholes and misleading situations for their own benefit. The Canadian government, like most other governments, is wildly corrupt from the inside out. Canada is a large country that's largely uninhabited by its people as well as Indigenous peoples, with lots of empty land with nature. Due to the cold climates and difficulty in importing foods and resources to those emptier lands. This land is filled with natural resources, which is the jackpot for industrial corporations seeking mass profits. The government is fully aware of the Eurocentric benefits this brings them, such as creating more jobs and helping keep our system and economy running due to the resources extracted and profits racked up, especially in deals with other countries and for our own country. They run the system, so they'll simply pull a few strings to bypass Indigenous land treaties and the judicial category, and let corporations do as they please. This ties back to how the Eurocentric system is built on the basis of greed and disorder, so deeply that it's near impossible to get rid of, as the entire globe is interwoven into its play for the past few centuries. Looking at examples, in Yinta, Wet'suwet'en land is unceded, fully separate from Canada. Yet, the judicial category of the government was in favor of the corporations, unjustly allowing them to continue operations via illegal loopholes, with the RCMP forcefully arresting protesters and resistors. This brings a question. Why won't Canadians and immigrants living in Canada, making up majority of the populace, stop this blatant injustice in the first place? It can easily be done if enough people stand up, right? Well, the government knows this, which is why they ensure to quietly shut down these Indigenous issues with cases like these, so as to not give people a reason to stand up. Secondly, they make sure that our supposed democracy creates division within the people politically, through parties and what you support. For example, the left and the right, creating figures like Ben Shapiro, which is supported and funded by oil companies. Very political, right? And the media that instigate this artificial divide to cause an internal conflict and constant war between the two sides at all times. As a result, the government is able to distract us from things they don't want us to know they're doing, such as the case in Yinta. as well as funding social media or political figures that spread propaganda on climate change being false or a leftist ideology or ploy, which ties back to how these corporations are easily allowed to keep doing what they're doing with the green light from the government. All in all, the key point here is that the government intentionally creates political division within our democracy, instigating constant internal fighting amongst the working class majority, which causes mass ignorance on real issues that the government wants to distract us from acknowledging, such as Indigenous land sovereignty. Without awareness, nothing can move forward. Let's move on to actual treaty examples in this argument. In Tricker Treaty, we went into depth on Treaty 9 from 1905, which was used to exploit its indigenous signers through a difference in used forms of documentation, that a land is theirs. Not only were they unaware of what was actually being signed and promised, as it was translated to them differently than reality for the government's benefit, but further attempts to remedy the issue was ignored, as the main proof on the land region's true owners was mainly oral from ancestors, not physical like Eurocentric systems prefer, which put all favors against them. Government has the upper hand here. Furthermore, other ways the government uses underhanded shortcuts for agreements is only agreeing to something regarding a land region with one indigenous community that's most likely to accept, counting for the entire region and leaving most in the dark about important decisions needing more consulting on. No consent is a breach of justice. Let's take a look at UNDRIP, the United Nations' Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The biggest issue with such declarations is that in the end it seems more like a suggestion and not a priority for a government, making them fully ineffective in most Eurocentric countries like Canada. If anything is to even be considered enacted on Indigenous land issues, it would have to be taken to international court, which is highly and mainly unlikely to happen in the first place. This is all due to the fact that in reality, the government doesn't want to deal with these issues, and the enactment of them would take a lot of hassle, resources, money, time, and energy. Not to mention that their Eurocentric system would completely have to change too. More government corruption can be seen in elected chiefs of reserves that work within the government system, which goes against traditional values and clearly leads to a money and power-hungry chief in a position of power. Reserves are a great example of how the government is stingy with money, only giving the smallest amounts of money as a supposed benefit while owing trillions to Indigenous people for all that's been taken these 500 years. The small amount of money that is given is then used as an excuse to not accommodate the reserves with anything else, leading to outlandish grocery prices, pipeline leakage issues, lead contamination, and more. And it's quite crazy. For example, there was a lot of lead found in children and adults on Indigenous reserves as a result of the drinking water not being fully monitored. But this was still not fixed, and it led to years before being fixed. And these issues are still going on today. Thank you for listening to my presentation.